And Clement wrote them a letter back. And the letter he wrote back was not to demand that they clean up their act, but to tell them, maybe you need to get rid of a couple of pastors. He says, I know that there's good in that church. And he begins to read off a litany of the good things that the church at Corinth had corrected and had done correctly. And one of the things that they said, it hit me hard, right in the heart. There were a group of Christians that were watching. The church at Corinth had exploded. It got great big. Other Christians that had nothing to eat. Nothing to eat. They were living on the street. They had nothing. And these Christians went to the marketplace and offered themselves to be sold as slaves. And the money was given to feed those who couldn't feed themselves. If that ain't love, folks, other than the crucifixion of Jesus, I don't know any greater love than that. To give up everything. You no longer have a choice about where you'll go or when you'll go, where you'll sleep or when you sleep. You'll no longer have a choice of when you can visit your family and when you can't. No longer have a choice about what your station in life will be, and from day to day where your hands will toil. And they looked at that, and they looked at the need of others, and they said, good trade. You know, some of you may know some of my story. When I was 16 years old, my dad came into the house one day, grabbed a suitcase, started throwing clothes in it. My mother was in hysterics. She was crying, where are you going? He got about halfway down the stairs, and he says, I'm going with my friend. And a guy at the bottom of the stairs who we knew was gay, my dad announced that he was gay. And he said, I can't live this way anymore. He came out of the closet. And when he came out, he left us all in the street. My mother was in hysterics for weeks. I'd always been a fairly bright kid. I was in ROTC, and I was in the Sea Scout program, and I was kind of in line to go to Vallejo Maritime Academy to become a merchant marine officer. I thought that was my best destiny. When my dad left, it all went down the tube. My mom started taking up with drunks in country western honky-tonk bars. She started bringing them home. And when she started bringing them home, like all big-time drunks, they made the decision that, they could manhandle the kids. Well, this 16-year-old was 5'10" and weighed 185 pounds. I didn't push so good. And one day, one of these drunks she hung out with most, he was standing on the stairs, and he ran his mouth too much, and I dribbled him down the stairs like a basketball. And when he pushed through the front door, he laid there groaning. My mother came out, and I told her, this can't continue. You're living like a whore. She dragged him inside, screamed at me, saying, don't ever come back, and locked the door. I lived in the inner city portion of the Mission District of San Francisco. It was a place where you could buy anything if you had enough money. And if you didn't have money, you did what you could do to get by. And I learned to get a new kind of smart, and it always involved a lie. The ends justified the means. I got tangled up with a girl whose family was equally screwed up. Wasn't long, she was pregnant. We found a way to wangle it where we could get married. The lie is just as good as the truth if it works. I didn't know how I was going to get medical care for her and for us to survive. So hey, the Vietnam War was on. Recruiters didn't ask too many questions. I got some gal off the street to come in and sign papers like my mother. And I joined the Army. And because I was in the Army, she got medical care and got taken care of. I found out I did really good in the Army. It was a discipline that I needed. I was chosen for leadership preparation school. I eventually went to the NCO Academy and was one of the youngest non-commissioned officers in the Army. There was a problem though. That's not what that young woman wanted. It was drugs and other guys. See, figuring it out for myself wasn't working. We had a little girl. And because of her drug use, constant partying, soon I lost track of where she was taking my daughter. I didn't know. And I began to hear from people who knew where they had been, and they were telling me horror stories about things that were happening to my daughter while my wife was passed out. I got a deal from the court. And it said this is a no-fault, non-contested divorce. And if you don't just respond and contest it within 90 days, you're divorced. I spent 90 days with all the time that I could away from military activities, talking to people, trying to see if I could find out where my daughter and this gal was, because I was determined to rescue her out of that. After that period had happened, it came back to me that this young woman had become an out and out. She couldn't get away from a spike. If you're not familiar with that, it's heroin addiction. And my little girl, nobody knew where she was, but it was a long way away. I asked the Army for help. They couldn't give it to me. And I'm not knocking the Army. They were very patient with me during this period. And I packed up all my civilian stuff, got my car, drove right out the front gate at Fort Lewis. And I searched and I searched until I was out of money, out of ideas, and out of luck. And I found myself at a gas station at a payphone on Barber Boulevard in Portland, Oregon. I heard about some preacher from a girl. And I had about enough money left to make a phone call. And so I called him. I didn't even know what for. And when I called him, I didn't tell him that I was running from the Army. See, your first 30 days gone from the military, they call it AWOL, absent without leave. It's a misdemeanor. And when you go over 30 days, they call it desertion. It's a felony. He invited me to come over to his house so we could pray. I told him I was out of gas. And I didn't know where he was because I didn't know Portland. He said, I'll pray for your gas tank. And I thought, great. I'm facing a felony beef. Everything's gone. My life's a mess. I'd failed to take care of my daughter. And now I call the only preacher who's going to pray for my gas tank. I've called a nut. He says, no, I'm seriously. I'll pray for it. He prayed for my gas tank, told me which way to go. I figured I was going to run out of gas anyway. Why not? One place is as good as next. I got in a car and I drove all the way across town and made it to his front door. I put out the last cigarette I had in the ashtray, walked into his house, poured out my heart to him, prayed to accept Jesus and make him the Lord of my life. And it felt like a 2-ton brick came off my shoulders. He offered me a small bedroom upstairs. I went upstairs and I woke up 24 hours later. I hadn't slept in I don't know how long. Still hadn't told anybody about what had happened to me. They found me somebody to stay with, a good man. I went to every church service there was, or every time the doors were open, I was there. I participated in anything they needed help with. It was a place where I felt like I was doing the right thing. I was safe. But like Onesimus, it kept coming back stronger and stronger. Son, you got to take care of this. Always leading, never pushing. You've got to do something about this. This can't go on forever. In the meantime, I met a girl named Melody. And we got married. I had a good job. In fact, I had a nearly new car. Wore a three-piece suit. And the day came when God spoke to me in no uncertain terms. Said, now's the time to get ready to go. I took my wife down to her parents in Drain, Oregon. Packed up my car, made sure I had my dog tags and ID. Sometimes that got you out of the you're a deserter thing. Went to the front gate at Fort Lewis, Washington. But the funny thing is, it was kind of like a cartoon. You know those cartoons where somebody has a little devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other shoulder? Well, I kind of had that. I had the guy in the red suit telling me, you're out of your mind, Jack. You better run now or they're going to have you. You're looking at a felony rap. On the right shoulder, It was a simple message. If you can't believe God now in this, you'll never believe Him for things to come. You got to believe Him to be useful. And I really did love God. And that went on mile after mile after mile from Portland, Oregon to Fort Lewis, Washington. I got to the front gate, pulled up to the MP shack, and said, "I'm Sergeant Van Meter, and I'm AWOL." He says, "You're what?" I said, "I'm Sergeant Van Meter, and I'm AWOL. It's my dog tags and my ID card." He says, "Well, no, you're not." He says, "Let me check here." He says, "I don't find you at all." See, after you've been gone so long, they dropped you from the rolls. And I said, "Yes, I am. Call the Provost Marshal's office. This guy's telling me to leave." They call the Provost Marshal. They use the FBI database. And sure enough, there I am. The guy says, "Pull your car over here." I'm expecting him to say, "Get out, put your hands on the car." You know? Pretty soon he walks over and he says, "There's an MP van that'll be down here in a few minutes. They'll tell you what to do." I waited. Van showed up. One guy got out. I was getting ready to get out. I figured time put me in the van. He says, "You follow us." So I drive behind the MP van. We get to the Provost Marshal's office where they have a big jail cage, and then they have an office. He brings me in, and he points me toward the office, and he says, "Have a seat in the chair." They take my dog tags and my ID. There's two guys that are locked up in belly chains and shackles inside the cage. And I'm looking at that thinking, that's me next. Pretty soon they come back and they say, "Yeah, we checked. Sure enough, that's you." I said, "Yeah, I'm here to surrender and make this right." Provost Marshal, young captain, he comes out. He says, "Give us a little bit. Going to decide what to do with you." He comes back finally and he says, "Okay, they've decided what they're going to do. These two MPs, they're going to help you out. You're going to get in the back of the van and it in with these other prisoners." "Yes, sir." Got in the back of the van. They're chained up. I'm not. The van drives around a ways and it stops. The back door's open and he says, "Sergeant Van Meter, here's where you stop." I get out. First sergeant is standing there. He says, "You Sergeant Van Meter?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Good. You're going to be platoon sergeant of 3rd Platoon." It's not even the jail. They put me in charge of a personnel control facility, controlling people who have gone AWOL. I'm thinking somebody's going to wake up, you know what I mean? This ain't right. So at any rate, I get there. I've got no uniforms. He tells me, he says, you need to get into your fatigues. And I told him I don't have any uniforms anymore, top. They send me over to the quartermaster sales store, and the Army pays for an entire new set of uniforms, ribbons, everything. I go back to the barracks, and he says, "Paymaster wants to see you." I go over to the paymaster's office. They've determined they owe me 30 days pay, and they pay me. It gets better. The next day, they're getting ready for Thanksgiving leave, and he tells me, "You got leave on the books. We're sending you home for Thanksgiving." The two guys pop up again. "You're out of your mind, Jack. You better run. They're going to come to their senses, and they are going to lock you up." And the other, "If you can't believe God now, you'll never believe Him for what He has for you later." I went home, had Thanksgiving, and came back. And when I came back, I ran the platoon, and I went back and forth for 12 weekends. Paid every 30 days. And this is going on. Finally, I'm called to an attorney's office. And the attorney calls me into his office and tells me point blank, says, I got to tell you point blank, I don't like Christians. And I don't think there's anything I can do for you. Next, they've decided to try you by general court-martial with a maximum penalty of 20 years of hard labor. It's okay. He says, there's one thing you can do. You can write a letter explaining all your circumstances to the commanding general, and I'll see that it gets on his desk. And you can make an application for discharge. So I wrote the letter. Now, remember, 9th grade was the last grade I completed. I was in the 10th grade when I quit. When life quit me. My penmanship skills were not the best. And they made me write this by hand. So I wrote it out, and I said I was a jerk. I was confused. I made a bad choice. I got saved. And as a product of that, I couldn't run anymore. I wrote down everything I knew about what had happened with my wife, which I subsequently found died of an overdose. I wrote down all the names, places I knew. He took the letter and said, I don't think it'll do much good, but we'll be talking to you about what they decided to do about pretrial confinement and all that stuff. Sends me out. It's a Friday. It's time to go home. You better run. If you don't believe me now, you'll never be able to believe me later. Three more weeks, back and forth. Same argument in my head, back and forth. On the last one, I was in tears. And I just broke down and said, God, what happens if they convict me and I get the worst of it? And the Lord spoke to me and said, what are you going to do with that? And I knew what he meant. Is this commitment to me real or isn't it? And that's when I made a pledge. I said, if it's your will that I go to the penitentiary, I'm going to go to tell everybody I can about Jesus. And I cried some more. The next week, first part of the week, we're at the company formation. I'm standing in front of my platoon. First sergeant says, Sergeant Van Meter, dismiss your platoon. I turned, gave the order, and then the first sergeant said, I need you to accompany me and these two MPs to the orderly room. I figured, well, it's finally here. They're going to take me to the stockade for pretrial confinement. We walked in. The MP handed the first sergeant a manila envelope. I was about shaken so hard. I can't even describe what it felt like inside. First sergeant opened it, read it, and with a poker face handed it to me. Inside were orders for 3 things. First, date and orders to clear the post. That's what you got to do before you get transferred to a military prison. Second, documentation of a complete and honorable discharge. And third, a forgiveness letter for anything I might owe the Army. I was going home. Charges dropped and honorably discharged. And I never did figure out how that came about, except for the hand of God, until many years later. Because the 9th grade dropout kid went home to my wife's home in Drain, Oregon. We went to the church she was attending, and there was a cop that approached me in the first service. And I thought, oh man, word's out, and now it's going to embarrass everybody. And he says, hey, you just get out of the Army? And I said, yeah. And he says, you know, we have an opening for a cop here. I said, what? He says, yeah, there's a job for a cop here. All you got to do is apply. They do the background check. You're in good shape. I thought, great, a background check. That's just what I want this guy to have. He bugs me 3 different Sundays. And finally, the Spirit of the Lord said to me, just do the application. I did the application. He comes back the following Sunday and says, okay, they did the application and the whole routine, copy your discharge. Chief says he'll hire you. And I said, can I see that? And I take it. I turned myself in. I've never been arrested. I had never been convicted of anything. I didn't have a record. And they gave me the job. Now it gets worse. I got over that fear. I worked for them for just a short time. And they said, we need to send you to school to become a paramedic. I said, really? Where are you going to do that? They said, at the college. I dropped out after the 9th grade. And they're going to send me to college? I was scared to death of that. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. I got straight A's through the whole thing. Then I found out that because I had been honorably discharged, that the VA would pay me to go to school. It was almost as much as I was making as a cop. And so I started taking classes. And I got really good grades in all the classes I took. And then I had taken so many classes and had so many credits, the registrar called me over and says, you got to have a degree. So they gave me an associate's degree. And then I took more classes and got a second associate's degree. And the same registrar came over and said, 2 degrees to a customer, Ace. You got to transfer to a 4-year school. I bundled up all my degrees and my transcripts. George Fox University had a program. I applied, was immediately accepted, and got my bachelor's degree. And then went on to seminary, and then went on to postgraduate school. The kid that was supposed to be arrested for beating up a drunk, the kid that was supposed to get caught because he lied about his age, getting in the Army, the kid who was shaking in his boots because he loved God and knew he had to turn himself in to being a deserter, the kid that was afraid he'd never make it past a high school class or a college class, wound up with 2 associate's degrees, a bachelor's degree, and a PhD. Now, if you're sitting here thinking, whoa, some kid, I'm going to tell you, no. Some God. Some God. Now, how does this tie in with this? I know what Onesimus felt like when he stood there and handed them those 2 letters. He was looking Philemon right in the eye. And he had no defense. No defense. You know, I don't know, because we're a small group, a lot of you I know fairly well. But I know what it's like to be in a position where there's something back there in the closet that's not right. And to have that thing bug you every day. Sometimes it gets so bad you're not even sure you want to be alive. And if that's you, begin to seek God about the proper time to make it right. And speaking of timing, I'll close with this. Remember I told you I didn't know how all that worked out with the army? Remember I told you that the Lord spoke to me about the proper time to go back? When I was in seminary, I ran into the Army recruiter recruiting chaplains. And he knew about my prior service experience. And he says, you ought to apply. And I told him, I hemmed and hawed and put it off. I didn't want him to know my whole story. And he says, no, you ought to. He says, they'll pay for your school. And I was mounting some student loan debt. I only paid off my student loans when I was 63 years old. And at any rate, he says, you ought to apply. I applied, and they said, well, they've accepted your application. They want to put you as a chaplain in the National Guard. He says, just a couple of things you got to do. There's some information you need from your prior service. And I told him I didn't have that information. He says, oh, I'll make an information request for you, and we can get your entire military record. And they'll send it to you. They sent me my whole military record. And it included all the information about graduating with high marks from the NCO Academy and all my overseas service and all that kind of stuff. But it also had all the narrative about what had happened when I was discharged. You see, it just so